What if I told you that the same mindset that builds championship teams also builds an extraordinary life? The same discipline that drives elite performance to greatness is the discipline that unlocks a longer, stronger, and more resilient future. This is where peak health meets peak performance, where we explore the science of longevity and the mindset of greatness. Because your legacy isn't just what you leave behind, it's what you show up with every single day. This is the Legacy and Longevity Podcast. I'm Zach Dancel, your host.
Hello, and welcome to this very first episode of the Legacy and Longevity Podcast. I'm Nathan Gwilliam, the founder and CEO of PodUp, and I have the honor and privilege of interviewing Zach Dancel in this episode. Zach is going to be your host in all future episodes, but in this first episode, Zach wanted to give you a chance to get to know him, to get to know the story behind this podcast, why he's doing it, what you're going to get out of it, and get to know him a little bit better and his experience and his expertise. And so I'm going to be asking some questions and allowing you to do that. So Zach is the Chief Operating Officer of Nava Health. He's been at Nava Health since 2016, where he's led the transformation of more than 60,000 patients through personalized functional and longevity medicine. He helps people live longer and helps them live lives that matter. He has spearheaded the launch of multiple state-of-the-art medical centers. He's built Nava's telemedicine capabilities from the ground up. He drove the creation and rollout of advanced medical and aesthetic services there at Nava. And he's achieved double-digit year-over-year growth in clients, appointments, and retail sales. Also, fun fact, he's a former Division I football player who played at the University of Maryland. Zach, thanks for letting me be with you today. So, Zach, can you start off by just telling us what really matters to you in your life? What is your why?
There's nothing more important to me in this world than my family. My wife, my kids, my siblings, my chosen family. So everything that I do today, I would say is for them.
Zach, is there a story that illustrates your family being the why in your life?
Yeah. So, a story as to, why my family is my why, right, is, growing up and seeing my parents, right? Like I said, the sacrifices, the grind, the work that they put in to provide for, the opportunities that I had in my life, that was provided by my parents. And that was the work that they put in. My parents are by far, they are my heroes. They were the perfect role models of what it meant to be a great parent. And them giving me those opportunities, them sacrificing their well-being, for mine, it gave me this fire inside as I grew older, as I met my wife, as I had my 3 kids, now being a parent of 3, I wanted to do the same thing. I want to be able to provide those opportunities, have those experiences, build those memories with my family the same way that I was able to do with my parents, and just being able to hold my kids in my hands. There's no greater feeling than being a parent for me, right? And there's nothing that I wouldn't do for them. They are my why, my purpose, my legacy, and that's what I would say that I'm going to tie back to, seeing my parents do that for me. Obviously I want to be able to do that for them and try to be a better version of they were for me, for them, and just continue to try to raise the bar.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing that. Zach, I agree. Getting to know you, I've seen how much your family means to you and what an important part of your life that is. I've also seen how much your leadership philosophy is reflected in everything you do. Can you explain your leadership philosophy a little bit more to us?
Yeah, I think, just taking, my lessons that I've, learned from sports over the years. I've really, grown into, this lead by example, right? Or leading from the front. I truly feel that in leadership, the most powerful type of leadership is being on the ground level, right? Is being side by side, that, no hierarchy, right? Doing the work that, you would personally do the work that anyone else that in your company is doing it, and truly showing them by example, right? Words can be all talk, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to, who's really putting that work in, to see your leader at the forefront and doing a job with you, I think is truly, the best type of leadership there is that can truly make an impact.
Yeah. I've done a couple businesses with David Neeleman, who's created 5 airlines. Um, he did JetBlue. I did Azul Airlines with him, and he's famous for that exact concept. That when when it was a holiday rush and he was at the airport, he just got behind the desk and he helped check in passengers, for JetBlue. So being willing to get in and get it done. Your time as a Division One athlete has been very impactful on you. Obviously, to get to that level and be able to perform at that level says a lot about who you are and your discipline and grit and your pursuit of excellence. Um, but also you learned a lot from that experience. Can you tell us how that experience, that time at the University of Maryland, kind of shaped who you are?
So just kind of put it all out there, right? My majority of my years I was at the University of Maryland. I got my degree in business finance there, but I was able to graduate early with a year of eligibility, and that which I did, complete my graduate year and my last year of eligibility in football at Wake Forest University. But needless to say, just that experience of, playing on that level um, of football, at that level of football, right? It's not many people get that opportunity, right? So, was extremely humbled around the whole experience. But, that version of me, was intense, right? I was consumed, with everything that I could be to be the best version of myself, right? My entire identity live and died on performance, right? When you get to that level, if when you truly want to be great at what you do, I had this obsession. I was meticulous with my time. Everything was structured and down to a T when playing at that type of level, and people don't really realize. But being a Division One athlete, you're also a full time student, right? So to be able to manage both, right? Being a great football player, being a great teammate, as well as trying to excel as a student. It was essentially like working 2 full-time jobs. But at the same time, right? I had this vision of, as a football player, playing in the NFL one day and walking out there on Sundays and having that experience. That my time in college was really, I was there to achieve that, right? So I wanted to be the best version of myself and do everything that I could to achieve that dream. So when there was a lot of people who went into college still unsure about themselves, what they wanted to do with their future, I knew at a very early age what I wanted to do. So I went into college already with this mindset. My goal is to be the NFL. Right. So what am I going to do with my time here that's best used to help me succeed and achieve my dream of becoming that player? So going back to, the college, going into college, still people being unsure of what they want. I knew it. Right. So, there was a lot of sacrifice that went into those decisions. While people were taking summer breaks, winter breaks, I was staying on campus. I was traveling to, a training facility, to continue, improving, my everyday performance, my craft, to be the best player that I could possibly be. So, and I would say not even just college, right? Taking that back to, my early years of playing in Little League, I knew this is what I wanted to do. So even as a kid, making those sacrifices for something that I truly wanted to achieve. My parents instilled those values in me because I was able to, witness them and the sacrifices that they made, you know, for me and for my brothers and my sisters. They came from nothing, and my dad started his first company in our apartment, 2 bedrooms, 4 kids, and on the kitchen counter, with a phone, and just seeing the grind and the work that they put in to go after something, for a better future for his family. I knew that was something that I wanted to do and that I had applied to my everyday life. That if there was something that I truly wanted, not there are no handouts in life, right? Everything is earned. So I knew that every day, I had to put the work in. I had to make the daily sacrifices and the daily commitments with myself to ultimately achieve my goals, right? So I was able to take that mindset in little league. I was able to, get recruited to one of the top high school football teams in the state of Maryland, Our Lady of Good Counsel, where my time there, I was actually the quarterback there, was able to win their first 2 state championships, and then had the ability to get recruited at the collegiate level, where I was able to earn a full scholarship to the University of Maryland, Wake Forest University, to continue my career as a football player, right? To take that next step in my path to ultimately achieving one of my dreams of becoming an NFL football player. So, that whole experience shaped who I am today. It's, football, I cannot say enough about, just sports in general, but football has truly crafted, the person that I am today. The lessons, the ethos that I live and die by every day.
Yeah, you can tell that your life has been forged by that sports experience. Can you tell us one specific lesson, one specific story that has stuck with you, that has really resonated with you from that sports experience?
I wouldn't say one specific story, right? There's accumulation of stories that have built into, the one thing that's really stuck with me, is the discipline to show up every single day. Especially on the days, where you don't feel like it. When it's inconvenient to you, when you're tired, your body's sore, that unfortunately, when you have that type of discipline and on those days where you don't feel like it, it's not part of the calculation, right? You showed up and did it anyways, right? Discipline overrode that. And, that's one of the things that I, live by today, right? Motivation comes and goes, but as long as you have that discipline and consistency to keep showing up, to keep stacking days, you start to build that compound interest over time.
I love that. Stacking days, compound interest, putting in the reps. It adds up.
Exactly.
So, Zach, how did you go from football field to healthcare? What was the moment or experience that made you realize you wanted to dedicate your life to helping people optimize their health?
Yeah. So, my whole life, I've had 2 dreams. The first was to play in the NFL, to walk out on Sunday and to live that moment that I had been chasing, since I was a kid. But the second was when football was done, which I knew eventually, there was going to come a day, right? You can only play football for so long. I wanted to, go work with my dad, right? Some of my favorite memories, came from all the days that, I spent with him in football, practice, the games, going to camps, traveling, across the nation to, all the different, stadiums. So, after college, I got invited to the Green Bay rookie mini camp. Flew out there, gave it
Congratulations.
everything
That's
I had.
huge.
Thank you. Yeah, so flew out there, gave it everything I had, and when camp ended, unfortunately, I didn't make the cut. So I came home, for a few days. I was still, in training mode, but I knew I had a decision to make. I could keep training and waiting for a call. Um, I could have went and played overseas to keep chasing that dream to ultimately get that shot to come back. But also at the same time, I was dating my best friend, the girl of my dreams, who's now my wife and the absolute rock star mother of our three kids. So at that moment, there was a shift, right? Because it wasn't just about me anymore, right? I wasn't this person off doing life by myself, right? Things were getting really serious. I really care for her. And, you know, being a football player, there is constant travel. The NFL and football is a cutthroat business, right? You could be on one team one week and then another team on the next. Um, but I'm not someone who truly I don't live with regret, so when I make a decision, it's done, right? It's gas pedal forward, never looking back. So after a few days, I finally came to the conclusion, it's didn't really talk to, my dad about it. Didn't talk to my girlfriend or my wife, about it. I just came to the conclusion that it was time for me to hang the cleats up and start my next chapter, right? I loved football. I still love football. Um, but I always knew that I had more to give to the world than just being an athlete, right? I wanted to make an impact on the world that I knew wouldn't involve football, right? Wasn't 100% sure about what it would be until more recently, working with my dad and being at Nava. Um, but just football gave me so much. Like I said, the lessons, the values, the ethos. That that's why I think for kids, right? Kind of go off topic. That's why I think sports or something along the line of sports. It could be competitive dancing, right? It's such an important you know thing for kids to do, right? Like what they're going to be able to learn from it, going up against adversity, right? Doing hard work, learning how to work with others, teamwork, right? But really like just doing something hard that isn't always daisies and rainbows, right? And to me, there's just no better teacher in life than sports. Almost everything that I still do today, everything that I say, everything that I talk to my team about, somehow I tie back or learned from the game. I've actually told my directors and my team that I want to run this organization as a football organization would run, right? Because just everything that I've learned from it's just such a great experience, and it's so applicable to everyday life. So in a way, I never really left it. I'm still in the game, right? My playing field just changed, right? Today's not about winning on Saturdays, right? It's about helping people win every day, reclaiming their health, their energy, their future, for an ultimately a better life.
So, Zach, why are you doing the Legacy and Longevity podcast?
For me, starting this podcast, wasn't just about adding something else to my plate. Being in healthcare, right? Seeing, the impact that we're having on people's lives and, just the state of healthcare that we are in today. It was about answering a responsibility. I feel that it's a duty to use my voice. And, to quote the famous Maya Angelou, right? When we know better, we do better. And I firsthand have been able to see what happens when people are failed by the system versus, when they're finally able to get real answers, real care. And, for me, I just couldn't stay quiet. And we need more voices in this space. So I wanted to help bring awareness, to the truth, that you don't have to be a celebrity or an athlete to access this kind of care. Everyone deserves that, right? Everyone deserves a chance to live not just longer, but to be able to live stronger, right? So, we shouldn't be going to the doctor just, after the fact that we get sick, right? That is the definition of reactive medicine. We should be doing the things prior to getting sick, right? Going to the doctor and getting regular lab work before we get sick so that we can do the things and implement the right interventions um, to prevent illness, right? Prevent future chronic disease. We're going up against some of the most entrenched, powerful systems in the world, right? With big food, big pharma, big insurance, right? These are trillion-dollar industries. You know, their profits are growing every year, right? Their profits are solely coming from people who stay sick, right? And so we're here to help flip that on the head, right? But I want everyone to also understand that this healthcare system, the healthcare system itself is not broke. It functions exactly how it's built. And it is a very, very successful business. But this system is not a path to wellness. But this podcast isn't just about health, right? It's about the mindset, about the leadership. It's about legacy. Your health is your foundation. Your mindset is your fuel. The leadership is the multiplier, and the legacy is that end game. How we show up, how you lead your family, your business, and your community. This isn't just that healthcare revolution that I talk about. It's a cultural one. Because if we can teach people to take back control of their health, their habits, their mindset, we're not just creating healthier people, right? We're creating stronger leaders. We're creating stronger families and stronger communities. The Legacy and Longevity podcast isn't just information that we're here to give out, right? We really want to make this a movement, where people out there, are already trying to fuel this culture shift, that we're trying to build this new system, right? A place where we can bring together voices, wisdom, real world strategies so that people can stop settling for just survival and start building a life, right? Building a body, a legacy that lives far beyond the years that we're actually here. Because when people rise up in health, in mindset, in leadership, that's where that ripple effect doesn't just change one life, right? It changes the generations to come.
So Zach, I completely understand what longevity means in the title of this podcast, right? Living a longer life, and not just more years, but thriving during those years, right? Productive, vibrant years. Can you help me understand a little bit more what the word legacy means to you from the title of this podcast?
Yeah. So legacy to me, right? Legacy to me is something that lasts, right? Something that, is going to be here far beyond the years that we're here on Earth. So to me, what that is the impact, right? What type of impact are you having on the world, on the people around you, your loved ones?
Yeah, no, I think I get it. So as I live a healthy, thriving life, and I have this mindset and this leadership, and I'm living my life at a elevated place, I'm going to be able to, as a natural result, have more of this impact and leave more of that legacy in the world. You've now helped transform 60,000 lives through Nava Health. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Nava Health got started, and then what it feels like to have that kind of impact on so many different lives?
Yeah. So, honestly, it's humbling. It ties back to that whole legacy part, right? To me, that legacy is impact. In every life that, we've been able to change at Nava, every family that we've been able to strengthen, is a piece of that legacy. That's part of, what really drives me. And that's truly what we're building. Nava's transformed over 60,000 lives. It's almost hard to wrap my head around. And yet, as big of that as that number sounds, I still feel like we're just scratching the surface. We're still just getting started. What we're doing at Nava isn't just about healthcare. It's rewriting what people thought was possible for their health. Their energy, their future. Every single client that walks through those doors, I see my mom in them. Someone who just wants answers, someone who is looking for hope or a sign of hope, someone who's tired of being dismissed, right? And that's why every night I can lay my head down to know that the world is a better place with Nava in it. because we're making real impact. 60,000, it isn't just a number, right? It's the ripple effect. In economics, there's this, there's what's called the multiplier effect, right? And I actually did this exercise with my team a couple months ago. When you restore one person's health, you don't just change one life, right? You give a wife her husband back. You give the kids, their parent back, full of energy and vitality. Someone who's able to show up and have the strength after a long day to come home and play with them. You give a company its leader back with renowned focus and clarity. So each life that we transform, it goes on to then touch hundreds, if not thousands of others' lives. So that's that ripple effect multiplier that I was talking about. And the exercise that I did, with my team was to see, okay, we've impacted 60,000 lives. What does that look like when you apply that method? And ultimately, it came out to an answer of seeing 60,000 clients, making the impact on the 60,000 clients that we have been able to touch. That then goes on to be able to touch at least 600,000 other lives, right? Because that person then goes, is a better, stronger person, more energy, for their wife, their husband, their kids. They're then teaching, what they're learning from us, to their kids, to live that healthier, longer life, that better future, the do's and don'ts of the world, because there's so much misinformation out there that we've been able to provide a platform to help re-educate, help shift that mindset of what it means to live an optimal life.
You mentioned your mom, and I know she was a huge part of the origin story of Nava Health. Can you share with us a little bit more about your mom's story and that origin story?
So about 14, 15 years ago, when I was still playing college ball, um, I started to notice my mom, who had never missed a game, suddenly wasn't coming to all of them. Eventually she just stopped coming to them. Um, and obviously being a young college student athlete, I wasn't asking questions, didn't think much of it. But, eventually, I know in the back of my head, it started to bother me. Parents being parents, being protectors of their family. Obviously, they didn't want to, come out and just say, hey, mom's sick. I think they didn't want me to worry. They didn't want me to be distracted. I'm a freshman in college trying to, do everything that I can to perform on the field. But eventually I did start to ask questions. And that's when I started, to find out that, my mom had been getting really sick. And, so I kind of, took a step back, right? Because people, don't think that it's going to happen to them until it does. But, when I took that step back in realization, I said, okay, so what, what are the next steps here, right? So she started, doing what anyone would do, go to see the doctor, because, that's what we're taught to do, right? That's what we've all been, taught for all these years by the system, right? Go see your doctor. And in that process, we quickly learn just how backwards and messed up this system really is, right? On average, you might get 7 to 10 minutes with a doctor, right? You list out your symptoms, they write you a prescription, and they send you on your way. There's no real deep testing. There's no real investigation into, what's actually going on. It's this one size fits all cookie cutter model, designed to manage disease. It's not there to create health. And that's one of the, the big lessons that we quickly learned through this process. And to not all of the doctor's fault, right? But this is just how they are trained. This is how they are taught, again, by the system, right? Because that system is controlling the curriculum, the standard of care. In fact, in order for these providers to make a living, they're forced to see 40 to 50 clients a day, right? So they don't have the time that they need to truly dig deep, and listen to their clients and do the research that's necessary, because, what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to make a living for themselves, right? They're trying to pay their bills. They're trying to keep their office lights on. So, it can't put it all on the blame of the doctors, right? Ultimately what it comes down to is the system that of the modern medical system. So as we're going through this process, my mom kept getting worse. She was bouncing around from specialist to specialist, and she was just stacking up prescriptions. At one point, I think she was up to 20 different prescriptions. All these different specialists were treating, every body system separately. So and they were treating symptoms. They weren't treating the actual root cause. So, as she's going through and stacking up these prescriptions that she didn't necessarily need, some of these prescriptions, they contraindicated each other, because none of these specialists were speaking to each other, right? They are, a primary care, a neurologist, a gut health doctor, a cardiovascular doctor, right? They are there to focus on their one system that they are there to specialize in, right? So there was no internal communication about the different medications that they're being put on to talk about truly treating the root cause. So none of
And then
this
she's
was helping.
taking more prescriptions to cover the side effects of the first set of prescriptions.
Exactly. Right. So she's up to 20 different medications, none of which were helping. She was exhausted and just chronic pain every day, and could barely get out of bed. After years of chasing answers, the doctors, finally, sat my dad and my mom down and basically were just like, we don't know what's wrong. All we can really do is help manage to make her comfortable. And at that moment, it was, like a switch turned on for my dad. And he was basically, screw that. I'm not taking that as an answer. And basically, from that point, he took my mom's health into his own hands. So he went out searching for answers himself. And, eventually he found a functional and integrative medical provider. And this doctor, didn't do what everyone else had done. This doctor slowed down. He listened. He ran advanced, in-depth testing. He looked for the actual root cause of what was causing all her symptoms. And when we saw that, we were like, okay, this is a different approach. But, at this point, we'll take anything, right? This is different from what we're used to. This is different from what we're trained or taught, but we'll take it, right? Let's see what happens going down this path. And so once they did all that extra workup before making any recommendations, before prescribing any medications, they took the time that was necessary to, look at the full body, as a whole, not just as a separate body systems.
And how did they do that? Through a whole bunch of testing?
Yeah, through a whole bunch of testing, right? At advanced, history, really looking at everything, surgeries, past medical history, family history, what interventions you've done, what medications that you're on. Tell us about your current lifestyle, your sleep patterns, your sleep health and sleep hygiene. How do you manage stress? How active are you? What type of exercise and movement are you doing? And then obviously advanced test, right? Your primary care, when you go get your physical, they're testing anywhere between 10 to 15 different biomarkers. Well, this time they tested for 90, 100 different biomarkers, right? They were doing things that, we had never even heard of or seen of, 15 years ago. Didn't even know it was a thing. And, after doing so, that doctor, and one of his colleagues was finally able to say to my parents that I think I know what's wrong and that I can help. I need you to trust me. I need you to do what I tell you, to do and what I'm recommending, but I can help. And at that point, that was all the hope that my parents needed, because it was the first time that a doctor wasn't just jumping to conclusions, wasn't just making recommendations based off of symptoms. And so what they did is they implemented these real interventions that the providers recommended, lifestyle changes, targeted nutrition, supplement recommendations, different supplement stacks, IV therapy, bioidentical hormone replacement. And slowly my mom started to get better and better, month over month. Eventually she got, she started to come back to life. So today, luckily, she's still here with us. She has, uh, you know, a bunch of autoimmune diseases at that time is what we found out is that, she had 10 or 12 different autoimmune diseases that basically her body was no longer capable of handling. Her immune system started shutting down, her organs started failing, and these medications that they were just stacking on top, none of it was helping or treating the root cause. But so by, we're lucky enough that she's still here today with us, right? She still has the energy. She's able to get up out of bed. She's able to watch my three little kids who are a handful. I love them to death, but she has the ability and the energy to take care of them, to watch them. And it's by the way, that doctor that I'm referencing, he's our current medical director here at Nava as well.
I love it.
So it's just amazing to see that. So at this time, we thought it was a miracle, but the truth, it wasn't magic. You know, it was just real medicine. It was root cause medicine. Someone who, you know, uh, broke out of the system, right? Who wanted more for his clients to, take the time to do what was necessary to get real results. And, we were just blown away, not just by how powerful it is, but just how corrupt and backwards the conventional medical system is, right? I want people to take a look at the current state of health today, right? The average American spends, I think it's around $13,000 a year on healthcare. Yet 6 out of 10 adults have at least one chronic disease. 70% of the US population is either overweight or obese. The US spends $4.5
Wow.
trillion a year on healthcare. 90% of that spend goes to managing preventable chronic conditions. Up to 80% of those chronic conditions can be prevented. And everything that we're doing here, at NAVA, right? So obviously the current healthcare system isn't healthcare, right? It's sick care. It's a system that is built, around the big pharma profits, insurance billing codes and symptom suppression, right? It's not real healing, right? And that's the experience, that changed, my family forever, right? It gave my dad his mission to decide that, he was shifting from a debt management, debt consolidation company that was super successful, doing business nationwide in all 50 states, to basically coming back and seeing what this type of medicine was able to do for my mom, to then go and apply it and decide that this is what he wanted to dedicate his life work to, helping people like my mom, people, helping people who were failed by the system, who deserves real care, real answers and real healing. So that's when back in 2014, Nava Health was founded. And that's ultimately the origin story of Nava.
I love it. Yeah, this is a subject very near and dear to my heart. As you know, my wife's in an electric wheelchair. She's had a lot of those autoimmune disorders and things that you talked about with your mom. And I am looking forward to bringing my wife out to Florida and meeting with you and your team and figuring
Yeah.
out what we can
Can't
do
wait to have you
to.
guys.
Who is the ideal audience for your show?
Yeah. So the ideal audience, I don't think that it's narrowed down to a very specific audience, right? When we talk about health, health is for everybody, right? Longevity can be for everybody. So, this podcast, if you want to pick an audience, it's an audience who wants something different, who wants something better, right? Who, wants to make that impact or create that type of legacy for themselves, for their family. But it's really for everybody who just wants to have that mindset shift, who wants to be a part of the change of what the meaning of living a fulfilling life really is, right? It's not just about healthcare. It's not just about mindset. It's not just about leadership. It's about bringing all of those pieces together, right? And this isn't for someone who, whatever your ambitions are in life, it doesn't have to be to climb to the top of Mount Everest. whatever your ambitions are, right, comes with the daily actions that are required to get to that, right, to achieve that goal. So I just want to be able to give a platform and opportunity, the tools to listeners that, you know, this podcast can be for everybody. We can meet you anywhere that you are on your journey in health and leadership and mindset to help you give you that upper edge on how to go on a day-to-day basis.
So when someone discovers your podcast and they really embrace that message you're talking about, what transformations do you hope to see in their lives? And what does success look like for your listeners?
Yeah, so I guess I would say when someone really embraces this message, I want their entire life to shift from autopilot to being intentional, right? The ultimate goal is a fundamental shift in mindset, right? People are compartmentalizing health is over here and work is over here, right? The whole transformation all begins, when those wall comes down and that all comes together. Success for a listener is when they stop seeing health as another item on their to-do list and they start seeing that as a foundational asset that powers everything in their life, right? Because most people are just surviving, right? They wake up tired. They drag, throughout the day. They're numb at night when they get home after a long day at work, and they're calling that living. I don't want that for them. I want them to feel alive again, right? I want them to, be able to come home after a long day and have that energy to, you know, be able to provide it to, their significant other or to their kids, right? I want them to be able to take ownership of their body, of their energy, their time, and their mind to start showing up with that fire in their belly, right? Like I said, for their spouse, for the kids and their mission, right? That's that deeper transformation. The one that I'm really aiming is when that connection comes together and they realize that optimizing health isn't just about feeling good. It's about expanding their capacity.
Yeah.
It's about having that longevity and the resilience to see, their biggest ambitions through, right? So success to me isn't about followers. It's not about metrics. Ultimately one day being able to get a message, from a listener saying, hey, because of your podcast, I'm now present again. I'm now, I'm a better leader for it. I'm becoming the man or the woman that my family needs to be. So, for me, that's the win. That's what this is all about.
So it seems like you've achieved a lot of success in your life because you're really self-disciplined. You've got a lot of grit. So Zach, you've said a couple of times a quote that if we know better, we'll do better. And when I know better, I do better, but I don't do as well as I want to do. You've been wildly successful in your life because you're an incredibly disciplined person. Um, you decide what you want, and then you pay the price. You put in the reps. Uh, some of us know better. We want to eat a whole food diet, right? And then we still go to Taco Bell sometimes. We want to do better, but we don't always do better. What advice can you give to the rest of us who maybe aren't discipline junkies like you are, but we still want to elevate our lives and get the value out of this podcast that you're offering?
Yeah, no, I think, the fact that, listeners are listening to this podcast right now, right? They've already taken that first step, right? They've already made that commitment, that intentional decision of, taking the time to better themselves, by, listening to, the different guests that we're going to be able to bring on about how we can do better, right? Obviously, if everyone was able to, have that type of discipline where they never mess up, right? Me myself, right? I although I am a very strong perfectionist, I am not perfect all the time. I make errors, right? I make mistakes. Um, I I also, will have a time of, where I need to do better, right? But coming to the table with the mindset of, hey, I might not have achieved my goal yesterday, but I showed up, right? I did try, right? today is a new day. I'm
And I'm
going
going to
to
try
now
harder
try
today. Yeah.
I'm going to try harder today, right? It's about just again, it's about stacking days. Not every day is going to be a win. We're going to go through our wins and losses. You know, life isn't always going to be in the green, right? You got to have your reds and your yellows. But ultimately, those moments are some of the best moments who that teach us, our lessons in life, right? You know, your greatest failures are always going to be your greatest teachers. So I think, you know, coming to coming to the day with a new mindset of trying to just get 1% better the next day or today than I was yesterday. It's not going to be perfect, but also understanding that, you do have to have the discipline to ultimately rewrite that and to get back on track.
Yeah. I love that analogy of focusing on getting 1% better every day. When my daughter was young, uh, we heard that story. It was the UK national cycling team, right? And and they were perpetual losers. They never won anything, and they brought in a new leader who focused on all the different ways they could improve, and they just focused on getting 1% better in a whole bunch of different areas. And and they became perpetual winners, the perennial superstars of the cycling world. And my daughter, when she was a dancer. When she was young, she just had movement, and she just couldn't not move. My youngest daughter, and so we got her in dance, and and she became a competitive ballroom dancer. And when she started years after her competitors started, and so she was way behind them. And we would go to these competitions after competitions, and she would lose, and she would lose, and she would lose. And we decided to follow this strategy of just getting 1% better every competition. And after each competition, we just ask her, did you get 1% better than last time? And she got so much better than 1% better every single competition. And and when she was going to college, she got a scholarship. She became a D1 collegiate athlete, a ballroom dancer. She danced on the number one collegiate ballroom dance team on scholarship in America. From that
That's
strategy you talked
amazing.
about, just focusing on getting 1% better.
You must have been a pretty strong role model for her to be able to get there, right? It takes a community, to raise kids, and I'm seeing that now being a father, and just seeing the impact that my dad and my parents had on my life. You know, I'm sure you had to play a very present role to help her, you know, get to where to get to that level, right? To be able to get a scholarship and to be on the number one uh, ballroom dance team. I mean, that again, that doesn't just happen by luck, right? That happens by her putting in the time, the effort, the sacrifice. That's amazing.
Yeah, she definitely deserves credit, and her mom deserves credit, not me. But it's fun to be on Team Becca and follow her dance
Yeah,
career. Can you share with us one of your biggest health challenges that you've faced, and how did you overcome that with some of these principles that you've taught us about and that you're going to be teaching us about with this show?
trying to be a high performing athlete. There was information that I grew privy to at a very young age, right? Because in order to be that high performing athlete, a lot of the things that we do or that we're going to be talking about on this podcast, to be the best version of yourself, to be the healthiest version, to have a strong mindset, to be that strong leader, a lot of that was instilled in me when I was young, when I was playing football, right? So I've been very fortunate that I haven't had to face, any really major health challenges in my life because, I'd like to, think that because I started so young, right? And this is the whole power of proactive and preventative medicine, right? Because I was, not that I'm obviously I'm still young, right? But if you're looking out there today, the obesity rates, the chronic disease amongst younger adults, um, there are people my age who are having major health concerns and health challenges. But the fact that starting at a very young age, nutrition was very important to me. You know, exercise was very important to me. taking care of my body, regular massage, acupuncture, doing the right things, stretching, um, taking supplements, right? Making sure that I had the right proper protein. So I think at a very young age, because I had a lot of that already built into my regular programming, you know, it is what has brought me to where I am today, where I didn't make a lot of the mistakes that I think people are falling into because, I had to do everything that I could to perform, right? And so if it wasn't going to my thought process, if this wasn't going to make me better, why am I doing it? Right? One of the things that I talk to my kids all the time about, the difference of being good versus great. Why be good when you can be great, right? So every day when I was training, right, my thought process was, is this going to make me better, right? Is this going to make me good, or is this going to make me great, right? So doing those things at an early age, then going into college where Nava started, where I could get in, do regular blood work, do regular massage, acupuncture, IVs, hyperbaric, you know, that was my place where I could really start optimizing at a young age that, like I said, I've been fortunate to, be pretty healthy, right? So that's, like I said, I've been fortunate, to where I am today, now being a father of three, it's not just about me anymore, right? This is about my kids. This is about my wife, what I want to pass on to them. And so I don't want them to fall into that broken system. I want to pass this on to them, so that they don't fall victim to that broken system, right? The same broken system that almost failed my mom. I want them to growing up knowing that they should be taking ownership of their health, from the very beginning at an early age to be able to prevent, to be able to be proactive from these, chronic diseases that are plaguing, the U.S.
Zach, you've told your story, you've told your mom's story. Is there a story of one of the patients at Nava Health that particularly stands out to you that you could share without sharing identifying information? Um, what was their initial challenge, and what did their transformation look like?
There's a lot of stories, uh, that we see just on a daily basis, right? When I first started at Nava, I started as one of the assistant managers in one of our locations in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Because when I first got in, my, you know, like I said earlier, my parents showed me that there are no handouts, right? Everything that you want has to be earned. So coming in, my dad didn't just want me to, be in corporate, to be on the administrative side. He wanted me to be at the ground level, learn the business, and to fully embrace everything that was going on. So I started out as an assistant manager of one of the locations, and I just on a daily basis, I saw clients coming in and leaving, and just the transformation that they were able to make, by just starting to coming to Nava, right, to getting the answers, right. Every person that I saw come in that door, I just had this picture and this envision. That is my mom walking in. That is my mom walking in, and to see them come in and you know constantly from patient to patient, say, you guys saved my lives, or you guys saved my life, right? As just been transformative and just more validation why Nava is here today, right? Is to have that type of impact.
Zach, in my research, I saw that there was a key play that you made in a game against Boston College where you recovered a fumble that was critical in preserving a win. Can you tell us a little bit about? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. You and I didn't talk about this at all before, but I think this is pretty relevant. Can you tell us about that play? Can you tell us about? Just give us a rough idea how much effort for that one little few seconds of play. How many hours and years did you put in to that, so that
Yeah.
the game win could be preserved? And what's the key takeaway from that in life?
you put thousands and thousands of hours of practice, efforts in the gym, strength and speed and agility training, all the film study, all of the the meal plans are, one of the crazy things that I did, grow up in high school, when I was trying to put on weight as an athlete, try to get a little bit bigger. I had a fridge sitting right next to my bed, and I had an alarm clock that I would wake up at 2 a.m. in the morning. I would chug down a protein shake and then go back to bed, because somewhere I read that, obviously at that time I wasn't as educated as I am now in nutrition, how important sleep is. But it was one of those things that, in your sleep, that's where your body does the most repair, right? So we thought, okay, let's give your body some more protein to do what it needs to do to give you that upper edge. Um, so all of the sacrifice and hours put into that one moment, right? One of my favorite movies of all time, Any Given Sunday, um, uh, you know, where he talks about just life is a game of inches, right? Truly tying that to not just a football game, but to life, right? That game that you're talking about, Boston College, where I recovered the fumble, I think we only won 3-0, right? It was one of the lowest scoring games that I'd ever been a part of. We were going back and forth. It was by far, a defensive game. But just like coming up and being able to, make that play in that instance, right? Kind of have like this flashback, okay, of all those hours that you put in, the thousands of hours, the waking up at 2 a.m. to drink that milk protein shake in high school, to put on a little bit extra weight, to add a little bit more muscle, was for this moment right here, right? To be able to, give your team that upper edge, for victory, everything, went into that moment, right? Because, it's a game of inches, right? You never know what's going to happen, but you have to be prepared for the unknown and be able to control, the chaos when things are chaotic, right? So, when I saw that ball pop out, I, instantly thought, okay, I need to hop on this to help seal this victory for the team. We end up winning 3-0. But just that one split second, right? Being in the right place at the right time, came from all the preparation, all the film study, and just again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's just about showing up, right? Showed up for that play, was able to recover the fumble and help lead our team to victory.
Yeah. And if you hadn't have put in all those reps, if you hadn't have put in all of those hours of time preparing in advance, you never would have been able to be there and you never would have been able to do what you needed to do. And we never know what those inches are in our life, right? And it's just our job to be prepared so that when those opportunities happen, we're ready.
Yep, exactly.
Your tagline is where health meets peak performance. Can you break that down for us a little bit? What does that intersection mean? And why is it so critical for people to understand this connection?
Where peak health meets peak performance, here's what I really mean. You know, you only get one life, right? We only have one body. We can't just trade it in for another. So we have to view health as wealth, right? Why wouldn't we treat our health as it's the most important thing every single day, right? So that is the foundation that everything in your life is built on, right? You can't show up fully, for your family, your friends, your team, or your mission if you don't first take care of your health, right? Because peak performance doesn't happen in a vacuum. Without energy, without vitality, without strength, you simply can't sustain the level of presence and excellence that your people deserve, right? So what do we do without health? If we really think about it, it's said all the time, but we can have all the problems in the world, but when we lose our health, we really only have one problem, right? Everything else stops, right? That's why health has to be a priority, because with it, you get the chance to perform as that father, as a husband, a leader, a friend, and without it, none of those roles can be lived to their fullest. So that intersection of health and performance is where legacy is built, right? So peak health fuels that peak performance. Peak performance shapes that leadership, and leadership creates that legacy, right? So that's that connection, and that's why it matters.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing. So you've talked about legacy. You've talked about things that are important to you, Nava Health and your family. What kind of legacy do you want to leave, both professionally and personally?
When I think about legacy, for myself, I don't think about titles. I don't care if people remember me as, a COO, this podcast host, or even a former athlete. Legacy to me is how you show up, right? It's the impact that you leave on the people closest to you. Your family, your friends, your community. So, I want them to remember me how I showed up. That I left everything on the field. Whether it was in
I
business,
love that.
fatherhood, friendship, and that I gave everything I had, right? Every ounce of energy, every drop of love, every bit of fight, to the people that I loved and the mission that I loved. And I think, when I talk about, legacy, there's a few different points of legacy that I have, right? There's professionally and there's personal. Professionally, my legacy is about more than just building this company with Nava. With this podcast, with everything that I touch, my mission is to change lives, right? To make that type of impact, to be able to prove that healthcare doesn't have to be this broken system that we talk about, right? To prove that leadership, can be done, with heart and grit, right? To prove that success isn't about what you accumulate, it is about what you become, and what you're able to give. I went into this thinking that I was gonna be fine. So personally, I want my wife to say that, he chose us every single day, right? Even when the world was pulling him in 1,000 different directions, I still was there every single day. To my friends, I want them to say that, that he pushed me, that he pushed me to become more than I thought I ever could be, right? That I was loyal until the very end. And, I want them to know, and they do know, the ones know, that no matter what is going on in life, no matter what happens, they could call me at 3 a.m. And just like the movie with Ben Affleck, they're going to know that my answer is, whose car are we taking?
Yeah.
But, really at the end of the day, what matters most to me is my kids. And this is the part that's hard. Having the relationship that I had with my parents, my parents are my best friends. I don't know a lot of people who can really say that. But for me, at the end of the day, what matters most to me is my kids. And I want them to be able to say that my dad was the best dad. He was our protector, our provider. I want them to be able to say that he was our biggest fan and that he loved us with everything that he had. He showed us how to do that with the discipline, with the consistency, the loyalty and the love that he had for the family, not just in words, but in how I lived every day, right? I want them to know that, their dad built something great in this world, but never at the expense of them, that my kids will always be my greatest masterpiece. So for me, that's the kind of legacy that I want to build. And that's what drives me every single day.
I love it. Thank you. Thanks for letting me be here today.
Thanks, Nathan. If today's conversation sparked something in you, here's what I want you to do right now. Pick one strategy, one insight, one small action you heard today and commit to it this week. Excellence isn't built in moments. It's built in the daily decisions that compound over time. Remember, you're not just building a healthier body or a more successful career. You're building a legacy that will outlast you. And that starts with the standards you set today. Thanks for listening to the Legacy and Longevity Podcast. If this episode was valuable, first subscribe so you never miss an episode. Then leave us a review to help more people find these conversations. And finally, share it with someone who you think needs to hear it. Until next Tuesday, keep raising the bar, keep pushing your limits, and keep stacking days. I'm Zach Dancel. Your legacy starts now.